The Nelli Stevenson Show is recorded on Wurundjeri country. Today's episode is brought to you by the fact that fund run donations, it is closed immediately, but if you want to know who funded a political campaign, you've got to wait 6 months until after the election. Today's guest, Dr. Rebecca Huntley, is Australia's foremost social researcher. For nearly 9 years, Rebecca was the director of the Mind and Mood Report, Australia's longest-running report on social trends. She's led research at Essential Media and Vox Populi before starting her own research and consultancy business, and she's currently director of research at 89 Degrees East. I've worked really closely with Rebecca over the last probably 10 years or so due to her impressive contributions to the climate movement's understanding of how people think, feel, act, and are motivated about climate change. And I'm really excited to have her on the show today. Rebecca Huntley, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I've been just really excited to have you because obviously I talk a lot about polling in my content and on the show as well. And I found that there is this real sort of distrust among the general community. And one of the things that I love about being a content creator is I've got this focus group on call. I can throw this idea out and people will come into the comments and let me know what they think, and I can ask probing questions and sort of dig a little bit deeper. And whenever I talk about the polls, particularly around One Nation, people are very, very quick to dismiss them and say things like, well, look, how can that be true? How can that be an accurate representation of Australians if you've only spoken to 1,000 people? Can you help our listeners understand how nationally representative polling works, particularly with regards to sample sizes?
I definitely can, but I think there's a threshold issue, which is that it's a very human thing not to want to believe something that confronts the story we tell ourselves about our own lives and about what the world is about. And in fact, we see that, that's, like I said, a very human thing, but I think we see it more now than ever before. So, I've been confronted with those questions before, and you can take people through a methodology and, but unless they've got a grounding in statistics, they'll believe it. If they're open to believing new things, that can sometimes challenge what they think about the world, or that in no amount of convincing or statistics or, I'm going to give you a boot camp in how polling works. And, don't take my word for it. Take every climate scientist who's ever tried to talk to a climate denier about that climate change is a real thing that's happening. So I think there's a more fundamental question there. I think that skepticism about polls or questioning or curiosity about how they work is important, but it has to come from a place not of, wanting to shut that down because I don't want to think about what that might mean. It has to come from a place of curiosity. Rule of thumb really is that actually the size of a poll is not, it's important, but it's also, you also have to think about what am I trying to measure with what kind of community. So, for example, I do a study of women living in Sydney for the Sydney Community Foundation, and we do that every 3 years. And the polling size of that poll is 1,000 because all we're trying to measure is women living in Sydney. And so 1,000 is weighted, and that's the other thing I would say. It doesn't matter if you have a poll of 10,000 people or 20,000 people. If all of those, 70 to 80% of that huge size of a poll are men living in regional Australia between the ages of 40 and 60, size doesn't matter. Every now and then, Nelly, size doesn't matter, and it's wonderful to be able to point to those times where size doesn't matter. So, I would always say, you have to have open questions about, the size of the poll, its representativeness, what audiences you're trying to understand. Is it full of push polling questions or legitimate questions? So it's a science, which is why they pay some of us the big bucks. But the other thing I would say to this, and I know that I'm not giving you kind of a rule of thumb about, what a good poll is and what isn't. I think we're also in a world where there is so much information, and the idea that there would be one source of truth in trying to understand the complex nature of how people feel about about even straightforward issues, like they want to eat at night or what they think of the Socceroos or something like that. It's a fantasy to think that it's something as complex as politics or any political issues like climate change could be adequately encapsulated in a poll, even the most well-conceived one, weighted to represent the Australian population, that's 2,000 or 3,000, is a fantasy. So I'm very much about, with our clients and the people I work with, a mixed methodology approach. What does all of the good research tell us? And that requires that kind of higher order thinking about what does this all mean? And even then, especially in this current environment where our political, while we can derive some understanding about what's happening in the political environment in Australia by looking at other countries, by looking at the past, how has our society navigated really difficult economic and social times with a lot of, change about how we get information. The future is not going to be anything like the past. So I'm also very modest about what I say might be happening or might not be happening, even though I kind of live and breathe the research, as you know.
Mm. So you've mentioned waiting a couple of times.
Yeah.
So for those of us who aren't necessarily,
Yeah.
across all of the language, I mean, you and I are, but
Yeah.
how does waiting work? So you mentioned you might have a poll of 1,000 and 60 to 7% of those are regional old Aussie dudes.
Yeah.
How does waiting work in that scenario?
Yeah. So every 3 years, we have something called the census. We're about to have it this year, actually. And most of your listeners would know what a census is. A census is basically it's not a perfect, but it's in some ways the best way we have about understanding how many Australians there are and the demographics of Australians.
So how old they are, where they live,
Where
how
they
much
live,
money
what
they
their
make.
income is, what their family formation is, religion, all the rest of it. Some people might remember years ago there was a push for Jedi, for people to write Jedi in religion. and the ABS said no.
I did that a couple of
Oh,
years.
did you really? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important. I was actually sort of backing that campaign because I thought it was really important that the Australian government and the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, had a good understanding of how many people had no religion in Australia. And I really welcomed that addition to the census, that they now understand and track that there are actually quite a lot of Australians, myself included, that are not religious. So but that was, the Jedi thing, that's a fun trip down Google or Wikipedia in Australian political history. Yeah.
So what happens with that census data is that you want to make sure that if you are saying that the sample size you have is broadly representative of the Australian population, it means you make sure you get a sample that reflects that demographic profile. So you don't want too many, you don't want more people in your sample that are younger than actually exist in the community, right? Particularly if you're trying to measure. So for example, if you're trying to measure and really understand how voters feel, you wouldn't include in that sample people who couldn't vote and anybody under 18. However, if you're trying to understand how the broader community feels, like how young people feel about respectful relationships, you might actually not care whether they can vote or not. Anybody who's a permanent resident, you would include that. So anyway, so the kind of fundamentals in a weighted poll are around age, gender, and where you live. However, you could weight a poll around a whole lot of other variables if you want. So income, education status, you might want to say, and you might boost a poll. You might want to decide, look, we want more people who are parents in that poll so we can understand, parents of younger or older people, whatever that might be, or people on a pension. The more variables you weight it, the harder and more expensive it is. Because one of our challenges with accessing these communities via often these paid fieldwork agencies that get people to answer surveys and all the rest of it is that it can be quite hard with some groups to get them engaged. You've got to do quite a lot. Conventionally young men have been very difficult to answer to get them to answer surveys. Maybe they can't concentrate for more than 2 minutes. I don't know, whatever it is. It's something I've often thought, how do we make sure that we kind of somehow recruit them through video games, or I don't know, how do we do it? So traditionally, sometimes we have to, we struggle with some groups within the community to be able to get them on these panels.
But does that mean, because something that I have observed a lot of commentary around in this sort of, I guess, group of people that are distrustful of
Yeah.
polls is, well, young people don't answer the phone, so this cannot be reflective of what young people say.
They often don't. Phone polling is very expensive. Most of it's online.
Yep.
I understand that people are questioning who are these people who are responding to these surveys. I get that. And of course, in the past, we have had scenarios where we could have something called a margin of error. No pollster will say that they can absolutely predict within, 1 or 2 percentages how people feel.
It's usually about 3.3, isn't it?
Yeah, again, it depends on the community you're trying to survey and the size of the poll. So, and the quality of the sample that you've got, right? So that can be true. It can be hard to access some communities. So, for example, we really, really struggle because to kind of have a real diversity of First Nations communities through survey work rather than through qualitative work. We really struggle with getting people on some of these where English isn't the first language and certain communities. And we we don't provide dual translation for these things. So there are certain hard to reach or we might reach those communities, but not the diversity of those communities. But, again, I think that part of the questions about polls, because the other thing that often is very difficult for people to get their head around is that they'll say, well, I don't trust polls. And then you go, well, in the last election, all of these polls were right, actually.
And then they say, but in the one before, they were all wrong.
Well, they're very rarely all wrong. There can sometimes, so the most kind of obvious example is the election where everybody thought that
Bill Shorten was going to win.
And there were some kind of things that happened with the border polling organisations after that. One of the things that we were, there was a range of different things that happened after that particular poll and new methodologies introduced. But I think one of the things that people forget with that is so much of the commentary around the polling kind of relied on this narrative that, it's not possible for somebody like Scott Morrison to win. Of course, you know what I mean? So there was a blur between the polling numbers and the commentary, and there may well have been a little bit of herding. Like
nobody wanted to be the outlier.
Nobody wanted to be the outlier and come out and say, it's going to be Scott Morrison. If anybody's interested in trying to understand what happened in that election and the kinds of things there actually were a number of inquiries done by the Research Society and a range of other peak bodies, like what actually happened. And then coming out of that, the Australian Polling Council, which I'm a member, was brought together. And actually there's only a handful of only major polling companies that aren't part of that council. Part of our code of conduct is that whenever we put a poll out into the field, so into the public arena, we have to disclose the sample size and the questions, and there has to be
methodology.
Transparency around the methodology.
Yeah.
But I think there has to be also sophistication around how we talk about these things. There's nothing, especially in the world that we live in, there is no guarantee. I'm very, very cautious about. The last two elections, I was quietly in my head, having looked at all the work, really quite convinced that the Labor Party was going to win, but I did not say anything because there is always that element of the unknown. And I'm not on the ground and all the rest of it, and we live in a system where weird things can happen. You know what I mean? I've got to say, in the last election, the level of distaste for the opposition leader was so intense. But the kind of ambivalence about the Prime Minister was still there. Labor's going to win. Did I think the size of the win was what I did not predict? And I think you can only look at that unless you're across that seat polling or doing focus groups in, let's say, some of those seats, for example, that went Labor to Green, or some of those outer metropolitan seats, like the seats of Hughes, where you were just like, I can't believe they won that seat. But there's that stuff. What I would say to your thoughtful, curious and listeners is there is a science behind polling, but nothing in this world is a crystal ball that's going to tell you the future. So look at all of it and know that that good pollsters spend a lot of time trying to get the right methodology and trying to get the right analysis. But it's not, nobody in this world is 100% correct all the time.
brings me to something that we've chatted about previously that I just found so fascinating. So it's you and I have both observed in focus groups over the past sort of few years post-COVID that there is just an entirely new level of distrust for institutions, for the establishment, for the media, and even, you know, what we would pretty comfortably say are like some pretty wild conspiracy theories. What can you tell our listeners about that?
Well, I think there are a number of things coalescing to kind of make that happen. I think there's a lot of really good work done in terms of trying to understand how our new information and communications ecosystem feeds that, but I'll set that aside. I can see that at play in operation in focus groups constantly. I'm not an expert at that, but I think that that's a factor.
Mm.
What I do find, separate from the of information that is kind of coming at people all the time, is just the amount of information and how overwhelmed people feel, and the complexity of the problems that face people. Just, you know, let's just take in Australia, which in some ways is you know, in some ways feels a bit sheltered from the problems.
We're very safe here.
Yeah,
Like when you think about the problems of the world, we're actually very, very fortunate and very safe, but we're still overwhelmed by it.
we're massively overwhelmed, and there's a kind of and this can actually cut across the political divide, a sense of trying to hold back a notion of despair about what can actually be done about this.
It's like a lack of agency.
Because there is a recognition that a lot of the problems that face us, even if you look at the top ones, the nature of the taxation system, artificial intelligence and technology, where our healthcare system is, including our mental health care system, the environment and climate, energy, all of it seems like, and housing, obviously. Everybody feels like, oh, these aren't problems that just popped up overnight. These are decades-long consequences of our leaders, particularly from the two major parties, knowing these are problems and kicking them down the road. And at the same time, feeling like they've yielded more and more freedom to large corporations to control not even just our lives, our economy, but our very sense of what is true and not true. So in the face of that, whilst also having to just, you know, get to work, get home,
pay the rent,
all the rest of it, look after your kids, it's a lot for people. So I think that sometimes and I think at a level both of individual psychology and collective psychology, this kind of sense of rationally finding a way to unpick this feels like too much, and feel like politicians and our leaders have got us into this mess and don't seem to have any desire or whatever, or invested in making sure we don't get out of it. And so in that kind of mindset, then your mind could go everywhere. It could just totally shut off from politics, or just collapse into a kind of all politicians are the same and the whole system is screwed up. And then you start to think that you're going to start voting for leaders, regardless of where they sit politically, who don't necessarily have cohesive, workable, or even ethical policies if they just look like they're going to throw grenades into the system, which is what you feel emotionally, right? So you've given up on the idea that your vote is a vote for an efficient government or a kind of competent and capable government that's going to chip away at the problems. You're going to give that guy a go, right? Often what would happen, if I look back at research that was done years ago, when we kind of see that people would go, well, we've given the Liberal Party a go and they've made these mistakes. Now it's time for the Labor Party to have a go. That kind of sense of that inevitable pendulum. And now people think, well, we've given both of them a go and they have, you know, screwed up A, B, C, D. And so now what we're going to, I mean, for some people that's a vote for the Greens or the Independents. For some people it's a vote for people like, you know, it could be the same kind of, in some ways at its core, the same kind of emotional impulse to vote for somebody like Zali Steggall is there for the people that vote for Bob Katter. Which is, at the very least, I'm going to have a distinctive voice of somebody who lives in my community and is going to put my community first. And they're going to be there in Parliament, pointing the fingers at two major parties to say, what are you doing about X? Or Jackie Lambie, or indeed Pauline Hanson. So that's kind of where we're at. And I think to understand it just in terms of kind of how politics works or how our political information system works fails to grasp the kind of individual and collective psychological, emotional response to the moment that we're at. But I tell you who totally understands the
Who's that?
emotional mindset of voters are populist right-wing leaders.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, look at people kind of criticize Donald Trump for being kind of a corrupt buffoon.
I think he's very clever. I don't think he's as dumb as he makes out.
Yeah, I mean, whether he's smart or not, I don't know whether it's a kind of rat cunning to be able, and in a sense, whether he's coherent on policy is irrelevant to the people he's talking to. He's talking to people as a way of stirring up a range of extremely powerful emotions that for them they feel they've had bottled up inside them for a long time. Largely, of course, shaped by kind of a kind of brutal economy, which feels like doesn't matter how hard you work, the promise of generational advancement, like your life of your kids and your grandkids is going to be better than the life of the people behind you, of your parents and grandparents, has been completely lost. And it's the same kind of impulse that is at work in the focus groups that I have, where people just have that sense of overwhelm, despair about the future that can often quite easily be the translation of which is, I don't know, like One Nation.
Yeah, yeah. And that's actually brings me to another question that I have seen a lot of people, particularly on the left, just genuinely really befuddled about. Why would, and you've mentioned the sort of the feels of it and the lizard brain side of it, but like so many people right now are asking me, asking themselves, asking others, why would people vote against their own interests? Pauline Hanson has a very clear voting record. You know, she only turns up half the time. The things she has voted for are going to make, you know, working Australians' lives a lot harder. Why do you think that people are voting for her, even when, from a policy perspective, it is against their best interests?
I mean, it's an interesting point. I mean, fundamentally, people often vote against their best interests. It depends on how you define your best interest. So, as somebody who's been on a reasonably high income, who's always voted for progressive parties, my definition of what my best interest is not lower taxes, is not more money in my pocket. It's more money for government and public services that can create the kind of society I live in. And I've got no problem about government money going to things that is never going to benefit me and my children, for example, or that are in my life right now, for example, the NDIS, or for art that I'll never see or watch. So how we define our best interests always shifts around. I think there are long and very interesting histories of why really poor working class people vote for conservative parties who have a contempt for, like often have a contempt.
Poor and working class people.
And are not going to deliver for them. And I suppose it's kind of like human psychology and behavior can be weirdly inconsistent and not necessarily logical or reasonable.
It's like that thing, the sort of meme that's come out of America, voting for the leopards eating faces party and then being surprised that the leopards ate your face.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is often a situation where, and I think it will be so interesting to see what happens in the next election, the kinds of voters who voted for Trump the first time and the second time, and given the second Trump administration makes the first one look, the first one look like
the Democrats by comparison.
Yeah, it just, it's like, wow. So you really it will be interesting to see the voters that do shift and where they go. So but just back to your point, Nelli, about what's happening with the One Nation vote. If anybody wants to try and understand the shape of the kind of like One Nation voters in its first wave and iteration, David Marr did an excellent quarterly essay on One Nation and actually breaks down who are they, mainly from the Australian Electoral Survey, which is always very, very useful, really very readable and for people to have a look at. So the One Nation vote now is different for a number of different reasons. And I want to
Mm.
identify some that your listeners might not be kind of fully aware of.
Please.
It's absolutely a response of a significant and potentially irreversible structural change in as the alignment of Australia in terms of its political viewpoint.
Mm.
So we've weirdly seen a kind of a stagnation in the Greens vote, and I'd be fascinated to understand. I mean, I have some theories about why that's the case, but in terms of
Can we unpack that first? Because that was something I was going to ask you
okay,
about because a lot of people are asking about
well,
that.
to admit that I haven't spent an enormous amount of time thinking about it, but what I
Mm.
have tried to work out is why has there been increasing environmental concern and concern around climate and not a, you would imagine, a requisite
Mm.
improvement in the primary vote of the Greens Party.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I think that's an open question. Why is that not translating? And
Mm.
is it because that people realise that, well, to do something on climate and environment, you need government, and so I'm going to vote for the Labor Party or whatever? Or is it because those voters have gravitated to climate-focused independence because
Mm.
climate's important to them, but potentially some of the other issues that are important to the Greens aren't important to them? But anyway, what we essentially do have in many ways, and particularly amongst younger Australian voters, is the kind of progressive centre voter bloc is holding up, but it's fragmented now. The Labor Party, and particularly what is interesting to me is the last election was the first election in the recorded history of the Australian electoral surveys that voters thought that the Labor Party would deliver for them on cost of living, so economically delivering them. So there's something also happening with the
Yeah.
Labor Party vote as well. And then you've got these community independents, some of which are the kind of what we would call teals, but are others are different kinds of independence as well. We're
Mm.
starting to see, and there's some of them we're starting to see, particularly in regional areas or outside the major states.
Mm.
Then you've got with the last, I would say the Tony Abbott's leadership was probably the beginning. There was a critical inflection point for the Liberal Party, which was the contest between Abbott and Turnbull. They could have gone
Mm.
down a Turnbull track, and because they largely chose a Tony Abbott track, it has really undone them. So, and now he's back. So, I mean, that's a doubling down.
Oh my God. And he won't go away. He's just like, I'm back and I'm on a speaking tour and
Yeah.
I'm going to inject myself into the media.
So
And
that
they're
was
like,
a real,
no.
you really look back, certainly when you're old enough like me, you look back at moments in your life where you made a choice, to do
Mm.
a particular thing, to choose a
Mm.
particular thing. And that was a choice. I don't know how you put the genie back in that bottle. What has
Mm.
happened is you've had the kind of collapse of a place where right of centre voters can go. And I
Yeah.
saw this in the focus groups I was doing after the last election. People are like, I don't know, where do we go?
Where's our
And
home? Where's our
so
political home?
where do those people go? Because those people didn't, if they wanted to vote independent, they would already have done that. They've headed that
Mm.
direction. They're never going to vote for the Labor Party for a whole range of reasons. They're unlikely to vote for the Greens. So you've got this block of voters trying to find somewhere to go. You've got, I think, some challenges with the National Party and a kind of how does the National Party reshape itself as a party that
Mm.
speaks for regional Australia, particularly as we see from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, not across all of regional Australia, but increasingly younger people are moving out of the big cities into regional Australia. And
Mm.
if that continues because of the kind of lifestyle they can expect there and ability to buy their own
And
home.
just, yeah, ability, exactly, to buy a house. Like my cousin
Yeah,
lives in regional New South Wales, probably about an hour west of Newcastle. And she works in commerce. She went to private schools, blah, blah, blah. But she had to move 3 hours away from Sydney just to buy
yeah.
a house.
It's going to, I mean, if it continues the way it does, it will reshape the very nature of some parts of regional Australia. So the kind of
Interesting.
raison d'etre of the Nationals, as well as the fact that the Nationals Liberals just are not getting on. So we've had a real structural shift, which is being reflected in voting. We are also, to all the things I've said to you, increasingly getting an active electoral expression of what has been brewing for a long time, which is the two major parties are just the same. And my life's not going to be better under one compared
Yeah.
to the other. And And which might be interesting to the people here, we are also getting mainly from men, but across generations, but also a bit from women, a real pushback on the gender equality agenda.
Yeah, I have noticed
Yeah.
that.
So we are finding in some of the work that we're doing, kind of like exploratory work we're doing as part of a longer project on democracy, unprompted mentions about not just issues like transgender rights, which has been a flashpoint, but just what's happening with men and women. So you might look at some people without that understanding might think, why is that Barnaby Joyce out in front of New South Wales Parliament
Talking
arguing
about abortion,
late-term
right?
abortion? There's a
Yeah.
reason. So, I mean, and part of this is part of the playbook of the ultra-right, where gender relationships are and anxiety around gender relationships and relationships around men and women and the gender equality question, separate from the issues around race and immigration, the rest of it, are at the core. And so we are seeing that in our research. So, for example, some of your listeners might be aware we do a segmentation called Climate Compass, which segments the Australian community into 7 different groups. The rejector group, the people who are strongly reject both the solutions and the science of climate change, 10% of the population, but in the equivalent segmentation we do on gender, it's 17%. It's nearly twice the size.
Wow.
And it is men and women, and it is younger men. It's not just older men, it's across the board. Some of them are educated
It's
and
that
wealthy.
manosphere thing, right? With
It's
the
real.
younger men.
So that, and there's a reason why in her time where she was less powerful and less important, there was a reason why Pauline Hampson was as focused on things like the family court being unfair to fathers as she was on immigration.
Because no one else was saying that. No one else was speaking to those disaffected men.
In fact, that's why one of the reasons why we don't have a family court, because Pauline Hanson, we now have a federal court. So they thought that a specialised family court that was stacked with, lesbian and feminist judges taking children away from their fathers. So that's where we're at. So the confluence of forces that are bringing about what could have been, I could never have predicted the percentages of people who said that they would put their primary vote to One Nation. So what's happening is the One Nation vote is now internally made up of, I think, in many ways, 3 groups. And some of the work that Redbridge has done on this has been very useful. The kind of typical One Nation voter who tends to be older, tends to be white, or second or third generation European migrant. It was okay that I came here, but I worked hard. Nobody gave me a hands up, and these people, free houses and free all the rest of it. And then there are kind of the whole system is screwed kind of people. And then there is a group of people, and part of it can be both a sense of economic loss as well as symbolic loss. Like I feel like I don't belong in Australia and I want some kind of return to some kind of nostalgic world where things were simpler, which is, again, when I talk about how important it is to understand the psychological response to all of this, it's not surprising that people who feel like our leaders don't have our back and the issues that face us are increasingly entrenched and complicated, that your response without that agency or sense of trust that leaders are going to do anything is, I want to go back to some imagined yesteryear. Things were simpler, you know what I mean? And I didn't have to think about all these things, and I didn't have to worry about pronouns or whether I could charge an electric vehicle or, where women didn't do or make me say things or whatever. I mean, I don't know.
I could say all the sexist shit I wanted and not be held accountable.
Yeah, and it wasn't
like that kind of thing. Yeah, all this political correctness.
And, and the other thing I think about this too is that one of the failures of imagination of so many of us, I include myself in this, in terms of how we respond to this idea of it used to be better in the old times and I want to go back, is that there were some great things. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. There were some really nice things about the 70s and the 80s in Australia, including what it was like perhaps to raise children without an iPhone around.
Yeah.
There were also some really shit things in the same way it is in now. There are some amazing things about the world that we live in now and some really shit things. It is this black and white thinking. We do have to acknowledge that some of the things that existed at a time in the past, and I don't have a lot of time for fantasy world about how the past was.
Yeah, yeah.
But
When we didn't have seatbelts and went flying through windscreens in
yeah,
car crashes
exactly.
and stuff. The good
But
old days.
there were some things about that time where I think about I think very simply in terms of the trajectory of my family, so my grandmother came to this country with no education, but
Mm, mm,
her daughter went to university, and that would not have
amazing.
happened initially. And that happened
Mm,
because university was free, and she became a teacher. And it was inconceivable that you would have two people who went to university with full-time jobs that couldn't afford a beautiful house and children and all the rest of it. And in those times, there were a ton of organisations that brought people together, whether that be the trade union movement, whether that be the
mm,
church, whether that be the
mm,
Country Women's Association, or any association. There were tons. People joined
mm.
stuff. Were the churches and the other organisations they joined always fantastic organisations? No, they weren't always perfect, but you felt buttressed and
Part of something.
supported. The Returned Soldiers League just does not exist in the same way anymore.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I understand that nostalgia, and I think we almost need to acknowledge there were things about the past that were wonderful and that delivered for people and
Mm,
communities. We're not all saying it's all terrible in the same way as we're not
mm,
saying that everything is either perfect or imperfect now. So it's that
mm,
recognition of the kind of the grey and the nuance.
mm,
And actually, lots of psychologists will tell you that overwhelmed, traumatized people are incapable of understanding the nuance. It's either black and white. Things are terrible.
mm,
Things are. There's this search for certainty is essentially a search for safety in a time of
mm,
overwhelm and lack of agency. And in that is the solution. There's a lot of talk about social cohesion. Some of it's very vague, and some of it feels like a stalking horse for other kinds of stuff. But
mm,
unless we remain a connected society, and unless governments and powerful organisations, public and private, create the conditions for true connection,
mm,
and a sense of belonging that doesn't kind of seek to obliterate difference, but actually
mm,
sees strength in difference, then we're just going to have more people turn away overwhelmed by the problems it faces and think, oh, I'm just going to vote a rock thrower into parliament, or, flamethrower into parliament.
mm,
I think that, again, politics is not, as some people would like to say kind of a slow arc towards you know, progress or the good. Politics
mm,
is a series of actions and reactions.
mm,
Something happens and there's a countervailing action to it, and that just continues to happen. And part of it is like, not so much how do we stop the reaction to the step forward, how do we respond to the reaction? So in some ways,
mm,
people would look at the
mm,
last election and say, oh my gosh, Australia rejected a kind of Trump-light figure, absolutely fundamentally rejected them. And it was a huge endorsement for a left of centre party. I don't think that's what happened, by the way. And then how could you then have this huge vote for One Nation? It's action reaction.
mm,
Yeah. So, I think the thing with the One Nation vote, Nelly, is that I don't know anybody who's got either the data or the crystal ball to say, will this 30% of Australians saying that they are going to vote for, if an election was held tomorrow, they would vote for One Nation. If an election was actually held, would they vote for One Nation? Who knows?
mm,
I don't think you can say that. How many of these people that are there, when really faced with a choice, actually go in that direction? But
mm,
we cannot think this is a kind of flash in the pan. And we cannot think
mm.
all these people are bad, wrong, can't be talked to in
No.
some ways. I think some of them can't be. That's just where they're going to stay. But what is it that's created this scenario,
Mm.
and how do we address the things that have created it?
So, Rebecca, what can we do and how can we talk to the people in our lives who might be drifting towards One Nation?
Look, I think the first thing to do is to listen, to understand what's pushing them towards One Nation. If at the core of why they're being pushed to One Nation is they
Sorry.
think that we shouldn't have foreigners in this country, then I've got to say it's very, very difficult to convince those people Australia's just full of foreigners. So it's, you know what I mean? Just why we are a migrant country. And there's no way. If somebody just doesn't want to recognise that, I don't know what you could possibly do about it. But for those people who are headed towards One Nation because they feel a sense of despair about the two major political parties in government and the ability of things to get better, and I think there are ways we can talk to those people. The first thing is to listen and understand what's at the heart of it. And I think the second is to try and, instead of lecture them, perhaps try and talk to them about why you still feel a sense of optimism and hope that things can change, and talk about the kinds of things that you're doing in your life as a way to counteract that sense of despair. I think you have to live it as much as way as anything else. You know, we've become such a shouty, intolerant kind of, you know what I mean? Like, just so easily triggered, whether online or increasingly face to face, about just getting angry very quickly. And no one listens to people when they're, you know what I mean, when they're in that. It's like any ability to kind of be curious or open dies away.
This has been my big advice to people. I gave a talk recently in the context of the lead up to the Victorian election. And now I haven't seen anyone do any research into how to talk to One Nation voters. Like, we just don't have that playbook yet. But the advice that I gave to all of the people in the room was listen, ask questions, be curious. Don't judge, look for the frames that they're talking in. And, is it cost of living? What do you know about cost of living? Yeah, I know. Petrol is really, like, seek to find connection with them rather than isolating them further.
And I also think what's interesting is, at the heart of it, people know that societies always flourish if different kinds of people come together in a shared project. And that's the history of Australia, actually, to tell you the truth. It was certainly of, from colonisation onwards. I know this sounds like such a small thing, but I think almost how we address this is in how we interact with people. I try and be really mindful about how I interact with all kinds of people on a day-to-day basis, including people who are obviously really stressed and angry, which is not to ever say you're put up with abuse. But, if you're on the roads and somebody beeps at you for no reason, you don't have to beep back at them. Are you fueling the cycle of anger, outrage, or are you disrupting it? And of course, as you and I, as climate activists, learnt some time ago, we have to think creatively about how we address things like getting on the engaging with people who are never going to change their mind online just helps. Do you understand what I mean?
And it's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned climate as well, because I think, thinking back to what you mentioned, what you were saying at the start of this podcast and now, is that this is not a situation where facts about policy are going to change minds. No. This is like climate. This is a situation where it's stories. It's going to have to be stories that we fall back on, because it's clear that, you can hop up and down and say, but the temperature is rising by 1.8. Like, you can do that as much as you want. That doesn't move people. No. But talking about the importance of multiculturalism, talking about the importance of, these policy mechanisms that have made our lives a better place, have made our lives easier, and talking about the things that actually make Australia a great place to live, rather than focusing on the things that divide us, I think is going to be really crucial.
And if you ever want advice about what to do, read, and there's now lots of really fantastic first-person accounts as well as articles, mainly coming out of America, about what happens when you had been people who've been Trump loyalists were even there, on the day that they and then what suddenly changed their mind. And it wasn't somebody yelling at them saying they were racist or whatever. It was like suddenly things didn't quite match up, and then they started to be open and questioning and curious. And it was often the people that they were able to talk to that still had those relationships that were like, yeah. And have you seen this? It's very difficult. If there was some kind of, simple formula to get to people, we would have done it by now. In so many ways, it's about something happening that makes them go, oh, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. And then it's if all they are is surrounded by people that kind of go, no, it does make sense. And if they've lost that connection with anybody else that's slightly different, some kind of rapport, then it makes it even harder for them to maybe that's not the case. I think we cannot lose the ability to have uncomfortable conversations with people who aren't exactly like us.
One of the things I love about my job.
Yeah, one of the blessings of my job is that I'm paid to listen to people whose views aren't the same as mine, whose lives are very different to mine, and really just listen to them with respect. I mean, I don't have to agree with what they all have to say, but at least
you do need to listen.
Or some kind of like, I'm a human, you're a human. Why do you feel the way you do? Not why do you feel the way you do, but genuinely why do you?
Why? Yeah.
And we need all to bring that into our interactions with other people. I've got to say, in 22 years of research, I could probably count on two hands, and this is like focus groups all the time, that people I thought, you are a genuinely horrible person. I have nothing in common with you and do not agree with one thing that you have to say. It's rare. It's rare. So I think it's that we just need to continue to cultivate the ability to have ongoing, sometimes uncomfortable conversations with people not exactly like us, because if we fail to do that, society could splinter in a way that could take generations to re-knit those connections.
Rebecca Huntley, it's been an absolute joy having you on the show today.
Well,
thank you so much. Where can people find you online?
Yep. I am on Instagram. Please don't try to join my private Instagram, because that's just a million photos of my children and my dogs who'd be extremely bored.
Fair enough.
But I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on any of those things. So LinkedIn, and I do have an Instagram.
The Instagram is Rebecca_Huntley_author.
Yes.
And I'll link to that in the show notes. And also Rebecca's the author of a wonderful book called How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. I'll link to that as well.
Right.
And I look forward to having you back on the show sometime,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
As always, if you enjoyed the show, please follow us on Instagram. We're at the Nelli Stevenson Show. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, review, do all of those things, and send it to somebody clever. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.